Hello and welcome to the one-on-one author interviews. And today we've got Jonathan Maberry as our guest. I am so thrilled to welcome Jonathan. And so I'm going to turn the mic over to him and let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Stephen King, and I write the bestsellers. Oh, wait, no, that's I'm Jonathan Maberry. I'm a New York Times bestselling multi-genre author. I write science fiction, fantasy, horror, thrillers, mysteries, comics, probably some other genres I'm forgetting at the moment. I write for adults, middle grade, and teens, and I write comics for Marvel, IDW, and Dark Horse, and I had a TV show on Netflix recently called V-Wars. Prior to that, I was a nonfiction writer for a long time, kind of part-time, and a martial arts teacher full-time. And I also am editor of Weird Tales magazine and the president of the International Association of Media Tie-in Writers, which are people who write books and stories attached to movies, TVs, video games, and so on. So that's the short version of me. Basically, I can't focus is what it boils down to.
Now, you say that, and yet so much of your work, if not all your work, really kind of circles around a loose definition of horror in all its many forms. What drew you to that genre?
Well, I was kind of bred to the horror genre. My grandmother, if you can imagine Luna Lovegood from the Harry Potter books as an old lady, the person who believes in everything, that was my grandmother. She believed in what she called the larger world. And it wasn't just the supernatural, she also believed in, aliens and other things. So she brought science elements into it, but taught me not only the folklore of it and, the folk stories and the classical stories of it, but taught me to read the science and anthropology and archaeology associated with it to try to understand the cultural and belief perspectives of people. So that was my childhood, like she was my favorite living relative, or favorite relative at the time. From there, I started reading, all the classic horror stuff, reading about the vampires and werewolves and other things that she had told me about. And I just kept expanding out from there. But as valid as it is to say that there's a horror element in most of my fiction, the one thing that also overlays that is a thriller model. Almost everything I write, no matter what genre I write in, is a thriller model. It's the race against time to prevent something bad, whether it's a supernatural monster, an alien invasion, whatever. And that actually is a direct result of having met one of the masters of horror when I was a kid, Richard Matheson, who wrote The Shrinking Man and I Am Legend, Hell House, because his 1954 book, I Am Legend, is the template for all of the weird science apocalyptic stuff that guys like me and James Rollins and Michael Crichton and so on write. If it wasn't for that book, we wouldn't be doing this. Okay.
So coming up through that time period, reading all of that over a period of years, horror has its conventions, its conventional stories that come and go, its subgenres that wax and wane. And they often say that when people are going through trying times, horror sees a resurgence. Have you seen that to be true, and why do you think that might be?
Oh, it's definitely true. And you can look back through the decades and see that what it boils down to is if we're dealing with a crisis in our own world, and we have the pandemic and other things going on, the political unrest and so on that's going on in our world, those things are horrible to us. I mean, they're the monsters that we deal with right now, but they don't have a good third act. And in horror, we can create a monster that is a stand-in for whatever we're actually afraid of. And at the end, the good guys find a way to defeat the monster. So there is that cathartic process in horror where you give what appears to be an insurmountable problem, some monster, an invasion, or whatever it's going to be, that just appears to be beyond the scope of the characters. But in the process of the story, we see ordinary people leveling up to learn how to deal with it and eventually actually dealing with it. And that's a comfort to us because, if they can do it, we kind of feel that we can do it as well. And I think that engenders within us a hope that's at the end of this, the good guys will win. And so I think that has a lot to do with our love of horror.
Now, that's an interesting take on it, because I have heard other people say that something that distinguishes, say, horror from dark fantasy is that horror builds on a sense of hopelessness. And yet you're talking about ordinary guys and ordinary people leveling up to defeat the big bad.
And yet it's the same. It is actually the same thing, because just because it builds on a sense of hopelessness does not mean it ends with hopelessness. Hopelessness is what we feel. It's actually the doorway for us in there, because we feel hopeless about the things that have been going on. Like a year ago, when the pandemic was exploding, and we saw no end in sight. There were no vaccines. There were no reliable treatments, and we felt hopeless about it. But now there are things happening, and fewer deaths and fewer infections. So we see then the third act of that story finally happening. But when it first started, definitely the hopelessness was there. With Jurassic Park, we know dinosaurs are going to get out and eat people. That's kind of hopeless if you happen to be on the island. But you also have in the back of your mind the knowledge that it's at the end of the story, somebody is going to survive, and hopefully the good guys. Mm-hmm. And so horror may dangle hopelessness, but it is not the purpose of horror to be hopeless at the end. Okay. There are some genres that are, mm-hmm. So the torture genres and so on are that. But most horror, even most mainstream horror, that's the dark corridor we walk down toward, or wherever that welcoming light of safety might be.
And, right on cue, we've got rumbling thunder. I don't know if it carries to the microphone, but it is a dark and stormy night as we speak. So perfect stage setting.
Of course, I'm in Phoenix, where it's 105 and feels like the end of the world. So, yes.
Well, do we die by water? Or do we die by fire?
Exactly.
Speaking of which, there are different types of stories that kind of cycle. There are the Godzilla kind of mutant atomic, or man has outsmarted himself with technology and comes back to bite us on the butt stories. There's the climate change stories. There's the alien invasion stories. All of those different flavors, and they come and go. What are some of your favorites on that? Or do you see some particularly coming back now?
I've always been a big fan of outbreak stories of any kind, and partly because when I was 13, Richard Matheson gave me a copy of I Am Legend for Christmas. So I've had a lot of a long stretch of my life where that book was so influential. So I love outbreak stories in all their different types. Whether it's in I Am Legend, the original book was a vampire outbreak. George Romero took the model and recast it as a zombie outbreak, and so on. I love outbreak stories because often they deal with people who do in fact have to level up, and often they're scientists or people with some degree of skill and the optimism that if you apply the right science, you get the right answers. I'm a science junkie going way back. In fact, my favorite genre of all of these things is what's known as science fiction horror. Everything from Alien to Event Horizon to, basically those types of stories, zombie stories or science fiction horror. I like the rational approach to trying to solve a problem. And those types of stories are very compelling for me. That's why I like certain types of zombie stories, which is one of the favorite genres of mine to write in, because the zombie, it's a wholly fictional construct in the way that it's presented in the films. The zombies in the George Romero films have nothing to do with Haitian beliefs or the religion of voodoo, nothing to do with that at all. They're flesh-eating ghouls, reanimated tissue, and mostly not based on any folkloric model. So they're a monster that once presented becomes an easy stand-in for anything else that we're afraid of. But specifically those things that we're afraid of on a big scale, something so catastrophic, it strips away the affectation that we normally play. We all take different roles every day. We're a different person with our spouses than we are with our friends, than we are with our boss, and so on. Takes all that away because the infrastructure collapses, and those affectations are tied to the infrastructure. It allows then the story to no longer focus on the zombie, but the effect of having our lives laid bare, which means that every good zombie story is not about zombies, but about people in crisis. An endlessly renewable and fascinating topic. And as somebody who loves problem-solving fiction, I mean, it's perfect for me. and I think a lot of people are drawn to it for the same reason. You learn the zombie rules, and if you learn the zombie rules, you can survive. And if you don't learn the zombie rules, you die. And there's kind of a lesson in that for all of us. Don't play with that piece of radioactive material. You're going to get cancer. Things that we can learn and then apply, which in its way then empowers us as the characters in the book and the readers who take those characters as proxies. It empowers us to feel that if we just learn the right stuff, we're going to survive that.
So having now lived through a pandemic, does watching how people have reacted change your thoughts for the next Outbreak book you write?
Oh God, the next Outbreak book I write is going to have a lot more stupid people in it. A lot. I actually did a couple. This is weird. Right before the pandemic, I started a comic book at IDW called Pandemica, which dealt with a bioengineered disease that in the book was deliberately released by a white supremacist group that was trying to reduce the numbers of people who were not white. I did a lot of work on the genetics and so on to make that as scary and plausible as possible. And it started coming out just before the current pandemic. It was actually for a while put on pause because it was hitting a little too close to home, even though the entire thing had been written in 2019. I feel like I've already done some of what I would do next based on this pandemic, because it was in that book. It was in that comic book series. But if I do another plague book, I will definitely dive even more deeply into the party over country, party over common sense, the bias against actual facts. That's going to play a lot more of a role in myself, because I absolutely dislike, and I would go as far as say loathe, anyone who puts their own personal agenda above the needs of the many. That I find is an appalling thing, and it's also the least patriotic thing or compassionate or empathetic thing I've ever heard. But we saw it for the entire length of that disease. So yeah, that'll influence future writings on that type of topic.
Yeah, I always was critical of horror movies where everybody heard noise in the basement and went in the basement to look at it, thinking, who would do that? And I've completely revised my expectations now.
I used to have this weirdly optimistic view that more people were smarter than it appeared, and that there was a greater majority of good-hearted people out there. That belief has taken some real hits over the last couple of years, real hits.
Unfortunately true. Now, you mentioned when you were giving us the broad brush overview of all the things you've done that you write for adults, middle grade, and teens. What sparked the interest in branching out into those other audience groups, and how do you split off what you like to write and make it appropriate to those readers?
Well, the way I got started in it was completely unintentional, and I blame my agent for it. I had been invited by Christopher Golden, who is an excellent writer and anthologist, to contribute a novella to an anthology he was doing called The New Dead, which were all zombie stories from a perspective that was fresh to the writers. Each of us had to go outside of our comfort zone. At the time, I had never done a post-apocalyptic story, and I had never done a story with a teen protagonist. So I wrote a story called A Family Business about an older brother teaching a younger brother how to be a zombie hunter 14 years after the zombie apocalypse. It went into the anthology, it got a lot of good reviews, that novella. And my agent, who usually doesn't read my shorter works, because she usually handles my longer ones, read it because of the reviews in Publishers Weekly and New York Times and so on, and said, this reads like the opening of a YA, young adult. I'm like, no, it's not. Because I had not intended it to be written for teens, just because there was a teen protagonist. And I hadn't read a young adult novel since To Kill a Mockingbird in the 7th grade. So she sent me a whole box of books of what was contemporary, this is 2008 or 9, of the new young adult books. And I was blown away. Scott Westerfeld, Cassandra Clare, Holly Black. I mean, these people were amazing. And I realized that not only had young adult come of age, it had come of age in a fearless way where the writers were no longer bound by any kind of genre lines. They went wherever the story went. If it meant crossing genre lines 5 times, that's what they did, which is incredibly liberating for a writer. So she asked if she could take that novella and shop it as the opening of a YA novel. And I reluctantly agreed, saying, you're going to be disappointed. One auction later, Simon & Schuster bagged it, and a whole bunch of sequels. There are now 7 books in what's now the Rot and Ruin series. The movie is now in development for film. There was a comic book adaptation, and there was also a web adaptation on Webtoons that was the #1 horror comic on Webtoons. I didn't do the adaptation, by the way, and Taylor Grant did. But something that I never really intended to do suddenly became, it's required reading in 8,000 schools around the world. It's nuts. It's like, I'm still surprised by what happened to that novella I wrote, for an adult zombie anthology. But in the actual writing for YA, the only thing I change is I'm far less potty mouthed when I write for teens. I am notably potty mouthed when I write for adults, as has been pointed out to me, but I don't really care. There are some things that I won't put explicitly on the page. Like, for example, if there was a reference to sexual abuse, that might be a reference to it. I'm not going to put it on the page. But violence and heartbreak and extreme stuff, I did put on the page because I don't believe in writing down to teens. If anything, I like writing up to them. I've met teens these days, and they're way smarter than adults give them credit for. Now, with middle grade, which is 4th, 5th, 6th grade, that came about a different way. After I had made my footprint in YA, I found my dream diaries from when I was 11. I used to dream in sequence. Each night, the story would pick up where it left off until the story wrapped. I have a weird brain. A lot of writers have weird brains. So I pitched that over lunch with my editor, and he said, "Oh, we got to do those." And he bought 2 books in the series, came the Nightsiders. It's basically me collaborating with my 11-year-old self. And those stories are different in that, since they're mostly for 4th graders, there's no romance in there. I don't have a shifting point of view. The narrative structure is a little less complicated. I don't say simpler, less complicated. But I still don't pull any emotional punches or thematic punches, because I respect what kids that age go through in the real world, having come up very hard myself in a very rough situation, rough family life. So I respect the intensity that they experience, but I also respect their ability to self-censor. If it's not going to be for them, they won't read it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's fascinating, and I love the insight into that. You also have done comics, and so are they comics that were standalone and not related to something that you had written as a novel, or a mesh of the two, or how did that happen?
Bit of both. I got scouted by Marvel, by Axel Alonso, editor-in-chief of Marvel, who had read my novel Patient Zero, and then just literally called me out of the blue and asked me if I'd like to write for Marvel. The silliest question I've ever been asked.
Yeah.
It's like, would you like a puppy? Yes, I would. So I went up writing. Start off, my first thing was a Wolverine project, then a Punisher project, then a Captain America project. So I went up doing a lot of stuff for Marvel, and was the regular writer on Black Panther for 2 years. Which was one of the greatest privileges of my life. And I got to write the feminist Black Panther, because when Reginald Hudlin, who was writing it before me, handed it off to me, he had T'Challa get injured. So his sister Shuri had to step up to be the Panther. And he did that because I had spent 30 some years of my life teaching women self-defense. So he wanted to give me something to really have fun with. So I got to do the feminist Black Panther for 2 years. And, but then after that, I focused almost exclusively on original project. I did a project for Dark Horse that was a straight vampire, downbeat vampire comic. I moved to IDW, I created my V-Wars project for books and comics there. The only other project I've done that was in any way connected to another license, after George Romero died, the estate had a script that he had started called Road of the Dead, which will probably never be produced. But they wanted to do a comic book prequel to it in hopes that it would, fill in the gap for audiences who are waiting for a little more Romero, and they know I had worked with Romero before he died. So I did Highway to Hell, Road to the Dead, Highway to Hell, and had a blast with that.
And then Weird Tales, because you've got a little bit of everything going on here.
Yeah, Weird Tales also came at me out of the blue, but that comes with a lot of interesting, weird connections. Well, first off, when I was a kid, the secretary, or the middle school librarian where I was going to school, was the secretary for a couple of clubs of professional writers, one that met in Philly and one that met in New York. Philly crowd was the epic fantasy crowd, George Sitters, Sprague de Camp, that crowd. And the New York crowd was whichever science fiction fantasy writers were in town at the time would have these, informal parties / meetings at this publisher's penthouse. And she would drag me along. So I got to meet Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Harlan Ellison, Arthur C. Clarke, all these guys when I was a kid. And that was, greatly influential for me. God, I wandered off into and I forgot what the question was.
Weird Tales.
Weird Tales. Okay, yeah. I know I was getting there. So Sprague de Camp, who was one of the people from the fantasy group, but also Robert Bloch, who was one of the people, he wrote Psycho. The other group were huge Weird Tales fans, Bloch having published in Weird Tales exclusively. And de Camp was the one who got the unfinished Conan manuscripts from the estate of Robert E. Howard, given to him through the literary agent, Oscar J. Friend, the junior partner of the Otis Klein Agency. And, so I was exposed to Weird Tales through two major influences on me. And Sprague de Camp also became a mentor of mine. Roll forward to when I'm married to Sarah, her grandfather was Oscar J. Friend, the literary agent who gave the unfinished manuscripts to de Camp.
Okay.
So one day we were walking through my scrapbook and she's like, why are you sitting in a photo with Uncle Sprague? I'm like, now unofficial uncle, but still, so I have that connection there. The first book I ever bought with my own money was a copy of Conan the Wanderer, an old Lancer paperback that, where the Conan stories are originally published in Weird Tales. And I've got all these different connections, all these different places. And then a producer buddy of mine said, hey, there's a group that's bought the Weird Tales library and trademark. They want to know if you want to write a story for them. So I said, absolutely. I wrote a swords and sorcery story. When they got the story, they also said, you know what, we'd like you to maybe curate the first issue of the return. Would you want to be the editorial director? And I said, hell yes. So I did that. And then they made me full editor, which I am now, and my second issue came out more recently. And so now I'm the editor of Weird Tales. And that was one of those bucket list things that was so much of a stretch. It was like, I'd love to do that. There's no chance. And also the magazine was currently idle. It died many times over the years. And I was a big fan during the Anne Vandermeer run when she was the editor of Weird Tales, which I personally think was the greatest run of Weird Tales in the modern era. So I was delighted to step on board, and we've got some really exciting stuff coming up with Weird Tales. I just finished the new issue, which has stories by Amakatsu and Fran Wild and just a bunch of other writers. And the winter issue is a swords and sorcery issue. So it's kind of like old, it brings me back to my roots. And Michael Moorcock, one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time, just gave me an excerpt of the new Elric novel for that issue. Wow. For the 60th anniversary of Elric. And that was, Michael Moorcock before I found out that, I had actually just finished writing an epic fantasy novel and dedicated it to him. And then suddenly here he is, the world is very weird, but it's weird in a good way. So big fan of that.
Yeah, that's a terrific story. And a little bit of a weird tale. So there you go. Now you've touched on writing some of the tie-in work, and obviously you're now president of the International Tie-in Writers Association. That means you've done quite a bit of work in that area. How do you put on one hat and take off the other hat when it comes to writing the tie-in works versus writing all the original work that you do?
I'm one of those writers that I benefit from having studied journalism rather than creative writing, I think. Because in journalism, we're not precious about our work. We're not prima donnas about our work, and we don't wait for the muse to whisper in our ear. We write the damn thing, fix it in the rewrite, and move on. So even though we put our love and passion into what we write, it's a very practical viewpoint, and I consider myself a pragmatist. So some years ago, back in 2009, I think I had written 4 novels by then. I got a reach out from Universal Pictures because they had seen a Facebook post, by the way. I was discussing werewolf films on Facebook. And they were redoing The Wolfman. And they reached out and said, hey, would you have any interest in writing the novelization of the new Wolfman film? We worked out a deal. I took the gig. It became my first New York Times bestseller, and launched me into media tie-in work, which I'd never done before. And by the way, I thought that when you did something like a movie novelization, you actually got to see the movie. Oh no, you get a script and a couple production drawings, and that's it. But when I get a project like this, like Charlene Harris reached out to me once and said, "Hey, would you be interested in writing a Sookie Stackhouse, True Blood short story for me?" And up to that point, I had read the books but not seen the show, so I had to do my homework, and it was fun. And by the time I did my homework, I was in the groove. Max Brooks, who wrote World War Z, had reached out to me around the same time and asked me if I'd like to write a G.I. Joe novella for him for an anthology he was doing. And when I was a kid, G.I. Joe was a 12-inch action figure from World War II, but these were the new science fiction ones, the little, so they sent me a case of DVDs, toys, and comics. So I sat on my living room floor watching G.I. Joe cartoons, playing with the toys, reading the comics for research. I was at work. And since then, every time something like this comes along, I just dive into the literature. I've done John Carter of Mars, Hellboy, Wizard of Oz, which resulted in one of my most important career moments ever. That's the story I did for there. And also made me ugly cry. I'll tell you that story if you ask. But also a bunch of other things. And Max Allan Collins, the guy who wrote Road to Perdition and so on, at one of the conventions asked me if I'd like to, take over the organization, because he was stepping down. And I'm pretty sure martinis were involved in the decision-making process, because I don't remember saying yes, but I remember getting congratulations notes. And also I have Deborah Stevenson, who is my vice president, is basically Hermione Granger on steroids. She is the most efficient, visionary, and wonderful vice president a person can have. And if anything goes right with the media tie-in writers, she's more to blame than I am.
So now I have to come back and ask you about that Wizard of Oz story.
Okay, so John Joseph Adams, one of the top anthologists around, had reached out to me about doing a story for an Oz anthology called Oz Reimagined. My first inclination, before I really gave it thought, was to write a story where the Tin Man gets the heart of a serial killer and goes on a murderous rampage, because I thought that would be fun to write. And my fans would dig it. But as I thought about it, I realized that that's really not the audience for Oz, and that would be too self-indulgent. And in media tie-in, you're not writing for your audience, you're writing for the audience of the license. So I reread the Oz books and realized there were gentle little kids reading those books. So instead I wrote a story about a little winged monkey girl whose wings were too small for her to fly. So she went looking for magic traveling shoes to take her all the places that the wings couldn't take her. And it was a charming, wonderful little story. And even as I'm writing, I'm like, who is this person sitting in my chair typing on my laptop? Because it's not me. Who is this guy? The story got a lot of attention when the anthology came out. And then I got a letter from the estate of L. Frank Baum. And at first I was a little nervous opening that letter. What it boiled down to is they felt that story was truly in the spirit of Oz, and it has since been added to the official chronology of Oz as a prequel.
Wow.
And I ugly cried. I lost it. I never foresaw something like that. And so stuff like that, is those weird things you never think about when you're going into writing, but they are massive mile markers along the way. And every writer has their own moments like this. But that one, I don't think there's any single accolade in my career that has hit me as powerfully as that. And it also reinforced, for any writers listening to it, I did that by going outside of my comfort zone, way outside of my comfort zone. And as a result, I wound up writing something that has profoundly impacted my career and my own view of my skill set. So I'm not saying I'm the greatest writer of all time or any of that nonsense. What I'm saying is that I was able to do that and get that accolade because I stretched. And I think that's a lesson for all of us writers, that sometimes the unexpected, just like Rotten Ruin being, sometimes the unexpected is the doorway that's most solidly open.
Yeah, that's a terrific story. And you've also done some TV with Netflix and VWars. So how do you straddle that line with TV and novels?
Well, the TV thing, I mean, I was not involved in the actual adaptation of VWars. That was another, I had a team of writers for that. I became executive producer toward the end of that run, and had it not died because in the COVID era, they didn't want another show about a plague on TV. So thank you for the plague. If that had continued, I would probably have been involved with Ian Somerhalder, our star, plotting and even writing a bit of the second season. Nowadays, I'm a little more familiar with how Hollywood works. I've got a movie in development. I've got a couple of TV series in development. And I'm an executive producer on all of them. So I'm actually actively involved in the process of cultivating these things. And it is interesting. One of the first things to learn is take your ego out of gear, because you're not the only expert on that material. You may be the expert on the original source material, but you have the screenwriter, the director, the actors, the cinematographer. You have to, it's not a matter of yielding control, but willingly accepting the shared responsibility for doing this, because it is about us, our project. My individual project still exists. The book will always be there. This is a new version of it that a team is doing. And by working enthusiastically with the team and really celebrating how creative and visionary so many people are in the different aspects of it, gives you a really wonderful insight into how TV works. And also, when you're not a jackass about this stuff or not precious about your stuff, more people in the business want to work with you. People don't like to have to work too hard with somebody who's too hooked on their own stuff.
It almost sounds like taking what was a solo project, and for the purposes of the TV show, it becomes more of a shared universe.
Yes, with a couple hundred people having input in different levels. So yeah, and I mean, like working with Ian, our star, he's become a very good friend of mine, and he had a lot of thoughts about what, the character, the dialogue changes. Sometimes he would go and change a line that's in the script back to a line from the book because he had read the books, and sometimes he would have something completely new. And you gotta respect that he's doing his best job for what he is the expert in, which is being a TV star. And by allowing it, it also allows you as the creator of the source material to then see a version of it that you can enjoy as a fan as well, because it's not entirely from your head. So there are surprises and new aspects, new interpretations that give it a new and multifaceted kind of life that I find extremely fascinating.
Well, you're really hearing in that case from the person who inhabits the character, which is about as close to having the voices in your head be real as you're going to get.
Yeah. And sometimes they inhabit the character in a way that's totally different than you intended. A good example of that is in the books and the comics, there's a character, an FBI agent named Jimmy Saint, who is actually in the books, his description is modeled after an actor buddy of mine, Keith Strunk. But the guy who was cast to play that character in the movie is full-blood Native American. So he looks Native American. His name is Michael Gray Eyes. When they knew they were casting him, they changed the nature of the character a bit. And then, of course, the actor brings his own special magic to it. And it became a completely different character with the same name. And I'm okay with that, because that version of it expands not only the diversity of the cast, but also the insight into those character motivations. A Native American becoming an FBI agent, considering all the politics and stuff that goes on with a Native American dealing with a Fed, becoming a Fed, that added a little bit of nuance, even though a lot of it was just underplayed with his natural subtlety of acting. So it was fascinating. I loved being on a set. I loved being at the table reads, and I loved watching the final product.
Well, believe it or not, we have blown through our time today, and I want to leave time for you to talk about anything that you've got coming up, recently released, just out, anything you can say about that, as well as telling people where they can find you online.
Okay, well, I hope you have a comfortable seat, because I'll do the short version of that, because it's been a busy couple of years. I mean, I just finished my 41st novel in 14 years. Um,
Congratulations.
Thank you. This one is a epic fantasy, Kagan the Damned. It'll be out in late spring, first of a new series. Just got a stunning cover quote by author James Rollins, which really pleased me all the hell. Because he really loved the book, you know, and so that's coming out. I've got 3 short story collections coming out and a novel coming out this year. So I've got Joe Ledger, Relentless, the 12th book in the Joe Ledger series, comes out July 13th. I've got Empty Graves, a short story collection of zombie stories, coming out from Wordfire Press on September 1st. Later in the year, I've got 2 volumes of a short story collection called Joe Ledger Secret Missions. They'll be coming out from Journal Stone. We don't have the date or the cover yet, but they'll be coming out soon. And I've got an anthology I co-edited called Aliens versus Predator, based on those 2 licenses. I co-edited with Brian Thomas Schmidt. It'll be out in November. And 2 more issues of Weird Tales coming out this year. So there's a lot of stuff. The easiest way to find what I'm doing, and you know, if they want to follow this weird, crazy journey, JonathanMaberry.com, and it's M-A-B, not M-A-Y, it's M-A-B-E-R-R-Y.com. If you're a writer, there's a page of free stuff for writers on that website. But we also announce the different things that are going on. There's a newsletter people can sign up for. Plus, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, LinkedIn. I'm all over the darn place. You can't get rid of me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and Morgan Bryce. I'm pretty easy to find under both those names, just about everywhere. But of course, most of the time you can find me here on ConTinual. So thank you, Jonathan, for being with us and sharing all the wonderful stories. And thank all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more author interviews coming up here on ConTinual, so we'll see you online.